Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's seminar hosted by the International Inequality Institute at LSE. My name is Paolo Brunori. I'm an Associate Professor and Research Fellow at the III. And today's speaker is Javier Terrero Dávila. Javier is an economist at the OECD, and he works on labor markets, income dynamic, geography of inequality, primarily using administrative data. He also is a PhD candidate at Université Paris-Saclay. He will present an international comparison on income intergenerational mobility. As usual, there will be a chance to ask questions following the presentation. We will take questions both from the audience here and online. But I will now hand over to Javier. Thanks to join us. Welcome.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much to the III for inviting me. I did my master's here, so it feels like coming back home. Today I'm going to be presenting a paper on intragenerational mobility, meaning we're going to follow people over time as opposed to across generations with intergenerational mobility. And I'm going to be presenting a paper that focuses on providing comparative evidence across 4 European countries using administrative tax records. This is an OECD project with Sebastian Konix, who is also an economist at the OECD. And now we're moving from, let's say, the OECD project into the academic publication. So any sort of feedback is more than welcome. This is going to be my presentation today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the motivation and the potential contribution to the literature of this project, the data and the methodological choices. Then we're going to discuss results, both in terms of intragenerational mobility across countries and intragenerational mobility within countries, meaning across demographic groups, and then some concluding remarks. So I don't think this slide is super useful to you, given that you're all here in the International Inequalities Institute. But why studying income mobility, not only across generations, but also over time, meaning why studying intergenerational mobility as opposed to intergenerational mobility, which tends to be more dominant in the literature? Well, the first reason is that because we have economies in the West, advanced economies that have been experiencing slowing economic growth and rising inequalities, there's an increasing salience of the question, what happens with the remaining growth, who benefits from the remaining growth in the economy, and whether in context of slow economic growth, people can still move up and down the income ladder. Barriers to mobility, in particular to upward mobility, have also individual costs. For instance, can lead to entrenched poverty and macroeconomic costs. If I think that the work that I'm going to put in my work, the hours, and in acquiring human capital is not going to translate into meaningfully improving my living standards and moving up the income ladder, I might decide not to do it, ultimately undermining productivity. And of course, we're all aware of the literature linking normally occupational mobility, and in particular the lack of upward occupational mobility or downward occupational mobility, to support for populist parties or for anti-system, let's say, political concepts. So, given the importance of this topic, unfortunately, most of the academic literature looking at intragenerational mobility across countries, given a cross-country perspective, has been using survey data. This is because this is fully harmonized. It provides a lot of income concepts and a lot of covariates that we can look at. And also because the access and the harmonization process of different administrative records across countries is particularly complex. Studying intragenerational mobility across countries matters because comparison across countries can give us a sense of what is the macroeconomic conditions or what is the policies that may improve, let's say, income mobility. But the problem is that the aggregate mobility indicators that are normally used in the literature when using survey data can mask a lot of variation along the income distribution. So intragenerational mobility, people might have different experiences of mobility depending on the income with which they start. And we argue also in the paper, we try to illustrate that granular evidence can also explain why different mobility metrics give a different assessment of how mobility or how favorable mobility patterns are across countries. So if you're familiar with the literature, you will know that in this type of literature, there are many indicators, absolute mobility, relative mobility, and so on. Depending on what indicator we look, often we get a different country ranking or a different impression of what is the country that has more favorable mobility outcomes for whom. We're going to illustrate that with some of this granular evidence. Perhaps we're able to better explain why we see some of these differences. As I was saying, most of this research is done with survey data, and this poses challenges, right? The first challenge is, of course, that we have small samples that forces us to rely on aggregate indices, and that stops us from looking at granular comparisons, both along the distribution and across demographic groups. In the case of Europe, which is the countries that we're working with, mobility windows are very short, and attrition rates vary systematically across countries, and therefore the extent to which we're getting actually unbiased estimates, it's questionable. We are all familiar with the problems of measurement errors at the top and at the bottom in surveys. We also have problems in administrative data. I don't think I need to go much in detail here. So what is the contribution? So what we're going to do is we're going to use administrative records from Austria, Belgium, Estonia, and Spain. I give an overview of this data after, to provide cross-country evidence on disposable income dynamics. And we're going to be following working age individuals over a 5-year period. And we're going to provide estimates along the entire income distribution. So the first contribution of the paper is that we provide, perhaps, say, first, to our knowledge, systematic cross-country evidence, so evidence across countries on intra as opposed to intergenerational income mobility using harmonized income records. And we are going to characterize these patterns along the entire distribution across 3 dimensions: growth mobility, which captures, well, income growth along the distribution; rank mobility, which you might be perhaps more familiar with; and absolute gains mobility. The second contribution is that we are going to be able to illustrate through these examples, and we're thinking about whether to work on this also formally, but for the moment with these examples, how cross-country differences in inequality and overall income growth can shape the relationship between these mobility metrics. When we say in one country there's more relative mobility than in other, in one country there's more absolute mobility, why the rankings differ, we're gonna show that the overall level of income growth and the overall level of inequality has an implication for how we compare these rankings, and therefore also can tell us, we can derive some insights from that. And finally, we're going to show that mobility gaps across socio-demographic groups also vary depending on the starting income position. So normally we would say, we would decompose rank, or we would decompose, if you're familiar with the indices, Fields and Ox or Sorox, by type of, by population group. We're going to show that actually mobility outcomes along the distribution vary. And what might be that one group has favorable mobility outcomes in one part of the distribution doesn't necessarily translate to the whole distribution. Okay? So we're building on an extensive literature on income and earnings dynamics. So there has been a push to use administrative records in short-term income dynamics, which is similar to what we're doing. You might be familiar with the Global Repository Income Dynamics project that looks at earnings across 10 countries using social security records. There has been a push over the last years to make available employee-employer data that allows us to have very good information on earnings over the life course. But the problem is that, of course, this data is missing the household context, sources of income like capital income, and the effect of redistribution through taxes and transfers. So we're not able to actually capture an approximate measure of living standards, or not as good as we would do with disposable incomes. The recent survey data approaches that are trying to offer a more granular view of income mobility, not just by aggregate indicators, but along the distribution. You might be familiar with non-anonymous growth incidence curves, in which we look at individual growths at different points of the distribution. Of course, the sample sizes restrict what type of cross-country comparisons we can do about that. I think there are very, very few papers that actually do this across countries. And there's no systematic cross-metric comparison. Normally, we focus on one metric, and we say there's more absolute mobility here than or less, or more relative mobility, but we don't do an effort to compare why these metrics systematically differ. And on tax record data, there are a lot of studies now looking at rank because it's very popular, and rank persistence, and also at top incomes using administrative records, but they're predominantly focused on relative mobility, and there's very little cross-country evidence yet, precisely for these problems of harmonization that we were discussing before. Okay. So, what is the data that we have? So here I do like a parenthesis to sell a little bit of the OECD, and then I go back to the paper. So at the OECD, we have been building an OECD administrative microdata infrastructure on incomes and labor market outcomes. So what do we mean by that? We want information on disposable household incomes. This implies we need to have information on all the earnings, all the market incomes, all the government transfers, and ideally all the government taxes. We want to have a unique identifier that allows us to track the person over time, but also a household identifier that allows us to compute disposable household income and allows us to see what are the living arrangements of people over time, basic demographic information, and sufficiently long panels, at least 6 years. So basically, to put it in simple words, we are building a silk or a new silk database or a list database with a panel component across countries using administrative records and normally capturing the whole population in these countries. Now, the countries that you have now in green are countries for which we have direct access. This is Spain, Belgium, Austria, Estonia, and Iceland. We have applications ongoing for France and the Netherlands where this data exists. We have established replicators in national institutes in Canada, Greece, and the Nordics. And we are starting, we know that there are also data that is suitable in the countries that you see in red, but of course, we're only 2 people, so there's only so much that we can do. Having said that, if you have access to some of this data, or if you have ideas and you have a paper for one country and would like to see how it looks to another country, please shoot an email. We're always happy to collaborate and to put our data. In fact, part of what I'm doing here is trying to move this infrastructure from purely policy use to also academic use. All right. So from this paper, we're going to be focusing only on 4 countries: Austria, Belgium, Estonia, and Spain. These are the countries that we have, that we are harmonized first, and therefore the ones that we know best. The first caveat to say is that, of course, we don't have EU-Silk. So the data that we have in the administrative records is never going to be as harmonized as EU-Silk. It's never going to be as comparable because we can only observe the things that go through administrative processes. And in many cases, it means that certain benefits, in particular, non-taxable benefits, tend to be missing for the data, right? What we claim with these countries is that we have most of the market income. We have most of the relevant benefits because the benefits that we're missing, education-related allowances, housing allowances, tend to be a very minor component of the total income of the household. And therefore, we can construct something that across countries we can compare in terms of disposable household incomes. This is moving very quickly, by the way. For instance, there were countries in which many of these fields were missing like 2 years ago when we started this project. So the access to this data is becoming more and more reliable. Okay. So in an income mobility project, we want to answer 2 questions. First is, what metric are we going to use? Who are we going to be following and for how long? So the income variable is going to be equivalent disposable household income. So all household market incomes plus government transfers, minor all taxes, adjusted by household size. So it's the best approximation to the living standards of someone. In population coverage, we're going to be covering working age population. This is to avoid transitions from school into work and from work into retirement, and also because retirement data in administrative tax records in the ones that we have is not particularly well covered. But it's an approach that is quite standard in the literature. We're going to also cap incomes at the very bottom of the distribution because normally people with 0 incomes in administrative records are people that have arrived mid-year in the country. We have a lot of people with negative incomes that are just compensating from positive capital incomes in another year. So in reality, they show in the bottom of the distribution, but they're in the upper end distribution. These are also quite conventional in the literature, these choices. And then the mobility window, we're going to be following people over 6 years, over 5-year period, but we have 6 years of data. We're going to be averaging the incomes in the first 2 years and in the last 2 years. This is also quite typical in the literature. Okay. So what mobility metrics are we going to be comparing? The first is going to be growth mobility. And the question is simply, are people getting richer? So we're going to be looking at log income growth of each individual. So these are individual metrics that then we're going to aggregate to show along the distribution, but they are calculated for each individual. And basically, in non-mathematical terms, this is basically income growth rates for individuals along the distribution. The second metric you're perhaps more familiar with is positional mobility. And the question is, are people moving up and down the ladder? And here we're going to rely on the traditional rank analysis. So we're going to observe the actual rank. We're going to see, okay, we're going to rank people by their income from bottom to top. So lowest income to highest income. We're going to give them a position. We're going to see how that rank looks in T1. We're going to compare that rank to T5, and we're going to see to what extent these ranks are persistent or not. We observe the actual ranks, and by running a regression, the beta coefficient is going to give us the level of overall persistence over time in ranks in that country. And finally, the distribution of absolute income gains. And here we're trying to connect with the literature that speaks of income growth, relative mobility, relative inequality, absolute inequality. And the idea is, okay, maybe incomes are growing at the bottom of the distribution, but is mobility narrowing the gap between those that start initially at the bottom of the distribution and those that are initially at the top. And for that, we're going to do two things. First, the absolute income gains. So in PP, so this is all in real terms in PPP dollars. I'm going to see my income in dollars 81, and I'm going to see my income in dollars 25, and I'm just going to subtract the two. And in a second step, I'm going to see, okay, that advancement that I have, or that decline that I have in incomes, in absolute incomes, how it compares to the country average, how it compares to the average of everybody in the economy. And when I put this along the distribution, it's going to tell me to what extent most of the absolute income gain happening in the economy is happening more at the bottom of the distribution or at the top of the distribution. Yeah? Okay.
And this is not an absolute term. I mean, it can be that one is negative and the other is positive and vice versa.
Yes, it can be that one is negative and one is positive.
Distribution is not affected.
Yes. Okay. So I think I'm actually very good on time. So we're going to start with mobility across countries. So apart from the fact of saying, oh, in Estonia, mobility is higher or is lower and so on, we want to start some, let's say, key findings across countries that could be of interest. The first one is that cross-country comparisons on mobility depend very much on which part of the distribution we're looking at. For instance, most of the cross-country differences that we're seeing in individual income growth, they happen at the bottom of the distribution. At the top of the distribution, cross-country disparities in income growth, and in this case in income decline, are not very substantial. Another example is that top incomes are pretty much shielded from the specific patterns of persistence, run persistence that are in their country. Meaning, at the top of the distribution, in all countries, top incomes behave very similarly, and they tend to be much more persistent, even though when we find wild differences in persistence in the rest of the distribution across countries. And then what we're trying to do as well is, I mean, I wouldn't call this a methodological contribution, but more as an illustration, is that differences in inequality and in income growth across countries can explain why these metrics give different assessments across countries. So when we're saying for whom, in which country mobility, for instance, is more beneficial from people at the bottom, we are going to see that these metrics tell us a different story. We're going to be able to reconcile these stories by looking at the inequality and the income growth of these countries. So countries with higher inequality tend to exhibit a stronger income persistence for similar growth profiles. So in places where income growth is distributed equally across the distribution, if there's more inequality, positional mobility tends to be lower. And in countries with higher overall income growth, normally they tend to show less narrowing of absolute incomes between those at the bottom and those at the top, even if the distribution is equally tilted in terms of income growth rates. This is a little bit dense, but now with the graphs, I think it's going to become a little bit clearer. So let's start just with comparing growth mobility and positional mobility. Growth mobility, the long income growth. So what we have here is income rank anti-1. So we're going to place you in a given percentile of the distribution at the beginning of the mobility period. And we're going to observe in real terms how much your income grows over this period. Okay. First observation that is, obvious is that we have one outlier, that is Estonia, in which income growth has been much faster across the whole distribution, and this has to do with the catch-up dynamics, and in Estonia, income growth being higher. But beyond the pure ranking of countries, what we can observe is, first, as we would expect, this is downward sloping gradient. So people at the bottom of the distribution, initially at the bottom of the distribution, have a lot of scope to increase their income, and they do so, whereas people at the top of the distribution have a lot of scope to go down the distribution, and therefore they experience income decline. This is traditional mean reversion in mobility. But what we're observing is that when we're comparing mobility across countries, well, much of the action is happening really in terms of income growth at the bottom of the distribution. So much of the differences in income growth, in individual income growth that we observe over the 6 years relate to differences that are happening for people that start at the bottom of the distribution, meaning for possibilities of upward mobility at the bottom of the distribution, rather than results at the top of the distribution, which tend to be much more homogeneous. Yes?
Are these also generally people who are younger?
These results hold exactly the same if you compute these metrics controlling by age. I'm showing the non-age results, but the results change barely nothing. Now, if we move to the second graph, in which we're looking at positional mobility and the rank. So this is a method that I think we're all more familiar with. Basically, we're ranking people at T1, we're ranking people at T5. We're seeing to what extent these ones have shifted. If your original rank didn't at all explain anything of your final rank, then we would see a 45-degree line. This would be that there's perfect immobility. If your rank at T1 explained everything of your rank at T5, if your rank at T1 didn't explain anything of where you went in the distribution 5 years after, then we would see an horizontal line. Values are between 0.64 and 0.79 for Spain. Now, two things that are interesting. First, what you're seeing here, this little line that is crossing is the beta slope of the regression, right? Is the linear thing. And this is giving you this value that is the overall persistence. Now, what we're seeing at the top of the distribution from the percentile 19th onward is that this linearity stops to hold. So this linearity holds very well across the distribution. So basically, your final rank and your initial rank explains pretty much the overall level of income persistence in the country up to percentile 90. But after percentile 90, what we see is that in all top incomes, this linearity is broken, meaning in all top incomes tend to be much more persistent, irrespective of what is the level of income mobility that you see in the country, right? So when we take an aggregate mobility index and we say there's more re-ranking, or in this case, run persistence is lower or higher in this country, is pretty much explained by what happens up to P90, but from P90 to 100, all these incomes tend to be much more persistent across all countries. Okay, now, the second step that we do is to try to compare this metric and explain why some country rankings might be similar or not. So ideally, if the distribution of income growth is more downward sloping, meaning if income growth is much higher at the bottom than for people starting at the bottom than for people starting at the top of the distribution, then what would happen naturally is that people at the bottom would overtake people at the top. And that would create some re-ranking. So we would expect that in countries where there's more a bigger difference along the distribution in income growth, we would expect also more positional changes. And this is why, in the case of Estonia, you see both things. You see higher income mobility for that income mobility, absolute income mobility is more tilted, and therefore there's more re-ranking in the economy, or the rank persistence is lower. But what you will see is that this expectation doesn't match in all countries. For instance, in Spain, we have the second steepest income growth profile, but we have the highest run persistence. Okay, so even in an economy in which bottom incomes are growing much faster than upper incomes, you're going to still be in a situation in which relative mobility is not very high. Why? Well, because higher inequality means that there's wider income gaps between the ranks. So between me and the next one, there's a higher gap. Between the next one and this one, there's a higher gap. So even if my growth is faster than the one, let's say, in front of me of the line, I don't manage to overtake them if I live in a very high unequal country. And the implication for this is that high unequal countries need much more progressive individual income growth to achieve similar degrees of positional mobility. Okay, so this is sort of the first comparison. The second comparison is growth mobility with the distribution of absolute income gains. So the chart that you're seeing here is the same as before. The chart on your right-hand side is showing, first, we're ranking individuals again at the beginning of the time period of the distribution. And then we're seeing, okay, what is, for people starting in the different percentiles, the average absolute income gains, so no income growth, but absolute income gains that they're experiencing. And we are dividing this by the mean absolute income gain that is experienced by everybody. And this is telling you basically that in Estonia, for instance, if you're in the percentile 20, on average, people are increasing their income by 1.5 the average. And if you are in the percentile 80, on average, they are increasing their income by 0.8% the average. Okay, so it's giving a sense of what is the distribution of what are, okay, regardless of growth, how does this translate into the absolute gaps in incomes for people starting and ending in different points of the distribution. And what we're seeing here is that there's a pretty clear switch in countries where income growth is on average higher, even if in the case that we have here, the distribution in income growth rates is much more tilted, meaning people at the bottom experience much faster income growth than people at the top, because higher aggregate growth raises all incomes. Even when growth is more pro-bottom in proportional terms, this means that people at the top experience more absolute gains as well. So, for instance, to put it simple, if I am growing at 50%, but my income is very limited, it's very small, then my absolute gains are going to be also very small. If someone at the top of the distribution is growing by 2%, but they have millions, in absolute terms, that implies that their absolute incomes is going to be higher. Because when we have higher income growth, we don't tend to have a much more tilted distribution of the income growth rates. This means that mechanically, high growth countries would need much more progressive income growth to narrow the absolute gaps between those initially at the bottom, and initially at the top. Okay. So these are the findings when it comes to comparing across countries. So we have tried not only to provide, let's say, a cross-country ranking, but to explain why these countries diverge and to show what are some of the patterns common to all countries and why the granularity matters. Okay. Now we compare mobility across socio-demographic groups. And we want to compare gaps in socio-demographic groups, let's say gaps between men and women, or gaps between people with higher education and lower education. And we want to compare this gap across the different countries that we have. So to do that, we're going to rely only on relative mobility, because these countries have very different starting incomes, very different patterns of income growth. So we want to focus on relative mobility. Now, what we're going to show in the analysis, this is just an example for you to understand later the graphs. Here we have a rank exactly as we had before, a rank chart, and we're showing, instead of 2 countries or 4 countries we've shown before, we're showing 2 socio-demographic groups. Okay, so for each initial rank, we're showing the mean rank that people of different socio-demographic groups that start in the same income level have achieved after 5 years. And what we're seeing is that there's, for instance, in this case, the age 25 to 34, the younger group is the blue, the older group is the red. So what we're seeing is that there's a positive gap between the young and older age groups at the bottom of the distribution, meaning young people achieve a higher rank after 5 years than old people starting in the same point of the income distribution, but that this gap flips around the middle of the distribution, and at the top of the distribution, we find a negative gap. Meaning young people that start in the upper parts of the distribution reach a rank that is lower than the one that older groups achieve. Note that here there's nothing, people at the bottom are still going up the distribution. This is mean reversion. People at the top are still going down the distribution. It's just the difference between these 2 groups. Okay, so now that we have understood what we're doing, the only thing that I'm going to be plotting is the gap between these 2 groups. So a value above 0 means a group is advancing more, a group below 0, a group is advancing. Okay, so age. So across all countries, the young experience greater recurrence management than older groups at the bottom of the distribution, but worse in the upper half. And we're going to see this type of heterogeneity in many different sort of population groups. The aim of the paper is not to explain specifically why this happens in all of this, is to show that we need to look at the starting position to determine whether a group has better or worse mobility outcomes. In the case of young people, it's quite simple to explain. There's a lot of, when you are at the bottom of the distribution and you're young, you have a lot of potential for still going up the distribution, either because you marry someone and now you have 2 incomes in the household, or you progress in your career. When you are at the bottom of the distribution and you are older, you have much less possibility of probably changing your situation towards the better. But the opposite happens. When you are young and you are 27 and you live in a very rich household, and then you leave your household, then you're normally going to experience more decline than someone that is 54 and is in a high income household. Yes.
Wouldn't another interpretation just be that at the beginning of your career, there's the initial wage is much less predictive of your career trajectory than at a later stage in your career?
Yeah, the issue is that if it was less predictive, you would also see up and down. there's a
Just get flattened, right? Like, so in your other graph, this would be just a decline in the correlation. Right, like, so essentially what you could argue is like, this is PhD students who, yes, they earn very little, but they do it because they know that a couple of years later, then they, you know, have a tenure track position, hopefully, and then they will earn well, or in the private sector, right? Like, so just like, I feel like the interpretation could be a bit more nuanced, because this might be an active choice to earn less, because you know that you will earn more.
Yeah, agree. Yeah. The same happens when we're looking at gender, for instance. Women find it harder to climb the income ladder, but this gender mobility gap is particularly substantial in the bottom half of the distribution, and this is related with part-time employment, with employment in industries that in which, you know, career advancement tends to be lower, or in which the potential for salaries increases is lower. But in all countries, but in Austria, and those who are familiar with Austria and with you know, in Austria, for instance, has one of the highest child penalties because they have, women don't return as much to the labor force after in Austria than in other countries. The moment that you go in the upper parts of the distribution, this mobility gap between men and women tends to decrease substantially or even disappear. The only example in which we have let's say, a mobility gap that survives throughout the whole distribution is education. So regardless of what is your starting income, if you have a higher education, you're going to achieve a higher income 5 years after than your peers with lower education. And what we are serving, although not that much, and here I'm not sure in Spain because we don't have any Spain education data, is that in some countries, this gap tends to become larger in the upper parts of the distribution. And we relate this to the idea of people in the upper part of the distribution with higher education being more resilient to shocks, more able to transition across industries, and so on in the paper.
So this is only lower education.
This is, yeah, so here we're comparing two groups, men and women, the 45, 54 to 25, 34. And in education, we are tertiary versus lower education. But in the annex, we also show the results for all education groups, and basically the pattern is the same. The education group in between would be, you know, the gap will be slightly smaller, but also there. So with this, I think perhaps too ahead of time, I'm going to move into the concluding remarks. So basically, we are providing granular cross-country evidence on income mobility along the entire income distribution using administrative records for EU countries. The key lessons are that cross-country comparabilities of mobility depend on where we start in the income distribution, and that this is some variation that we are normally missing in studies or in cross-country studies that tend to rely on aggregate indices. We also show that inequality and the overall level of income growth can go a long while in explaining why we find different rankings in mobility metrics between countries, or better in explaining why some mobility metrics tell us that mobility is better in some countries than in others for people at the bottom of the distribution. And within countries, who gets ahead also matters, also depends on what is the starting point of the distribution, and mobility gaps across age, gender, education vary substantially along the distribution. I have not shown results for rural, urban, and for other population groups, but it's essentially the same. It's very hard to find an outcome in which the mobility gaps don't switch at different points of the income distribution. So avenues for future work. Well, first we need to get this published somewhere, so all the feedback is encouraged. But then the idea would be to extend in these traditional EU and OECD countries. So as we clean more countries in this infrastructure, we are aiming to, you know, to integrate them into the paper. Examining the role of life events. So the next step of the type of policy analysis that we want to do with infrastructure is observing income shocks that happen to people, or changes in the household composition, or changes in employment. There's a lot of work, for instance, on the child penalty looking at earnings. We could also look at earnings, but also at household incomes, and how the incomes and the previous earnings of both partners translate into penalties on both sides, and so on and so on. And then ideally, we want also to work on quantifying the role of tax benefits in shaping these cross-country mobility differences. So being able to not only to say, here is our data, look at all these interesting patterns, maybe there are some lessons that we can learn from it, but also explain a little bit more why we see these mobility patterns across countries and how the tax benefit system can influence that. I think I am a little bit
So thank you for the insightful presentation. So we now open for questions from the audience. For the online attendees, please submit your question via the Q&A feature of the bottom of your screen. And if possible, state your name and affiliation. But we will start taking questions from the room. And then maybe Peter will tell us if there is something.
Thank you very, very interesting presentation. I had a question related to your very last point. Because so you are using disposable income, right? But in the beginning, you mentioned that you have pretty much a good picture of market income for most of the countries.
Yeah.
So I was wondering the justification for using disposable income over market income, because typically with disposable income, we can have like a same mobility level in two countries. In one country driven by career progression patterns, typically, and in another one by taxes and transfers. And both would be merged into disposable income, but not market income. So I think intuitively, I would have performed the analysis on market income and then compare with disposable income to see a little bit like to answer like your last point. So I was wondering about this.
So 2 points on that. First, the reason why we're using disposable incomes is because it's normally the convention in the literature to try to approximate as better as possible the living standards of an individual, right? And for that, we need to take into account the context of the household and then the governments and the transfers and so on. On your point, I agree. I think a good step would be to carry out these metrics only looking at market income and then on disposable income and comparing them. It's also interesting to know that when we're looking, for instance, on rank, and maybe this is something that goes a little bit beyond the presentation, but one would expect, like, because the rank is also affected by the shape of the distribution, right? If your shape of the distribution is more compressed, it's easier to re-rank. If your shape of your distribution is more wide, and it's harder to re-rank. It's not clear that by using, it's not clear that the only thing that you are capturing when we're looking at markets versus disposable incomes is an effect of career progression or an effect of the redistribution of transfers, because you are affecting, let's say, in this metric automatically the how wide or how straight is the distribution. But I agree that the next step, at least, would be to compare these metrics between market and disposable incomes.
I was thinking more for the growth results, because I suppose most welfare systems are probably somewhat rank preserving. I would suppose. I don't know. But
well, actually, that's interesting. But more redistributed systems are not necessarily rank preserving, because in fact, when you plot these things, they look actually surprisingly similar, because you have an effect that is you're automatically, when you're using the disposable incomes, compressing this distribution, and therefore jumping becomes much easier than when you're just looking at the market incomes. Even though with market incomes, income changes are obviously greater because you don't have the effect of taxes.
So change in ranking should be exactly the same, no? Because there is a monotonic relationship within your disposable income and your gross income. I mean, hopefully, the fiscal system does not re-rank people. So
no, but applying taxes or transfers, it does. No, this relationship, yes.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. I'm Akanksha from Indian Institute of Technology, Jodhpur. So I have two questions. One is about what you presented. So when you're looking at age cohorts, younger age group and older age group, and the income mobility, is it also possible to look at it in context of occupational mobility? Because when you see in the younger age cohorts, the mobility is more for the younger ones, and there's not much of the difference. But as you progress for the higher income groups, it flips and the gap is much bigger. So it'll be also interesting to look at the nature of occupation. Is there any way like we can do that? And also look at it in context of occupational mobility, because when you're looking at the younger age group, the occupational mobility could be higher, right? So people are more mobile, like
There's
they,
more
they
job,
can
job
experiment,
transition.
they can explore new skills, and they can do all of that.
Yeah.
But in older age group, and if you're looking at higher income groups, people generally tend to earn more because of specializations they develop cumulatively over their lifespan. So is there any way like we can look at it in context of occupations as well?
Yes, so, I mean, originally this data is based off census data, but then we merged with tax records to have the whole population. We are now starting to also merge social security data into it, and therefore we are able to see also career transitions and job to job mobility and so on and so on. So, of course, I would assume that part of the explanation that you're seeing here is that, of course, when you are in a younger age, you move more across occupations and across jobs, and therefore you have more earnings volatility than what you have when you're older. And therefore, when you're at the bottom of the distribution, you have more scope to go up, and when you're at the top, you have more scope to go down. But this, of course, could be linked to occupational mobility as at an next step.
Thank you. Another question, not very specific to the presentation. So you initially spoke about the occupational mobility and the downward occupational mobility and upward mobility. So can you just like briefly tell like how do you really decompose that? That's for my own learning.
No, I mean basically there's a bunch of papers. I think the best paper for this would be here. Would be Courer, I think 2020, in which basically what they do is they show not only across generations but along the lives of people. So what happens when people have, let's say, they rank educations based on skills, higher skills occupations, lower skill occupations. What happens when people move from a higher skill or a middle skill occupation to a lower skill occupation? In particular, they link these to specific industrial shocks that make people that are in a higher skill occupation be unemployed and needing to find a job in a lower skill occupation. And they link this to mobility support. But I mean, we're not doing that in the paper, but that I think would be the reference that you would be looking for.
Okay, so yeah.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I'm Clara. I'm doing a master's in economic policy and international relations, and I was just wondering. So, for your so the rank mobility, it showed obviously that people at the very bottom do manage to improve their rank, but they're still very poor on average. I was wondering if you did anything on if, for example, how many people from the lowest quintile managed to end up above the median or something like that, and who these people would be.
I think that is a great point, and we haven't done this in this paper. Rank measures have become extremely popular among economists, and they look at averages. Normally, in inequality literature, we tend to look at the median outcome. This is not the purpose of this paper, but if you run these ranks, and instead of looking at these ranks, you look at the actual median values, you realize that much of this upward mobility that we see here and this income growth is driven by a few people that grow their income a lot rather than by a general movement of improvement at the bottom of the distribution. So what we haven't done in this paper yet, and I'm not sure if we will do, to be frank with you, is looking at the, let's say, what happens in the intra-percentile of this. So whether you actually see that the median outcomes resemble the average or not. But it's true that when you do that, you realize that many of the rank papers, and I look also, and I think also here of the rank intergenerational papers, to what extent should we be looking? I mean, it has very nice properties to look at means and an average, and it allows to have beta and to run a regression and so on and so on. But the reality is that when we look at this in terms of median outcomes, mobility is much, much lower than when it resembles when you look at mean outcomes. So I think it's an excellent point. It's just that we don't need anything about that in the paper because we're following conventions. But I think it's an interesting avenue. Yes.
Right. So I am Dipanshu. I'm a visiting scholar with the Oxford Department of International Development. I was very intrigued by your topic and the presentation. So thank you for a fascinating paper. So I have the two sort of very clear observations on this. One, spectrum is something we engage with questions on multidimensional inequality, which in our case, we're looking a lot at questions in India around access inequality. where access to basic, pillars, social security, finance, those are being measured for communities. And the way we have been looking at this is at provincial level, measure it for states, how states are performing. And that's one of the things that, of course, now the UNDP is looking at that report. We've been producing this for 3 years now. What I wanted to ask you is, how do you deal with the question of informality in context to the labor market? See, because this is something within the UK as well now. A lot of people where real wages are not rising across sectors are engaging in work which is not purely captured by the tax data as such. In India, as you know, it's only 2 to 4% of the population paying tax. So that data set methodologically will not yield a lot of insights. And I think this is a big question for developing countries or people in immigration now coming in to the new markets and engaging in what you call as, you can use words like side hustle or extra income jobs when real wages are not going up. So this is a limitation. Of course, methodologically, there's not much, but from an aspect of what's happening in contextual terms, how does the research at OECD engages with this is something I would probably ask.
So that is an excellent point, and the answer, of course, is we're not doing anything about informality because we can't. Whatever doesn't appear in our tax records, we cannot observe it. At the OECD, we work mostly with advanced economies. Informality is big in some of our member states. That's why we have decided to focus this paper, well, first for data availability, but also in countries, let's say, European countries where this problem is lower. And I think this comes back to what extent, what are the advantages of survey data versus administrative records, depending on what context, right? We needed to have administrative records because for us, the important was the granularity along the whole distribution. We required really huge population samples, to compute something like this, to compute ranks across different groups, across the whole distribution. You just need the whole population. Otherwise, you run out of sample very quickly. But I think that several approaches that have been integrated into EU Silk, for instance, in the context of European countries, which is the one that I know more, integrating administrative records within surveys is a good balance to this. Because in that case, all the informality is captured by the survey, but you also have a reference point and all the income that is declared appears in administrative records. So that is probably the avenue if you want to apply this type of work in context of high informality, would be to try to combine administrative and survey data. Probably you're not going to reach this granularity, but it's probably the best that you can do. In our case, we don't have a way to disentangle, and I don't think we will ever, whether there's some informal income that is not being declared in this case. Yes.
I have a question about the data more.
Yes.
Thanks for your talk. So because you mentioned you're linking to various data sources, or you're working on that process, and whether it would be or ever will be possible to link it actually across generations as well.
So you know that in the earliest literature, the employer data sets they last for long. They have a very long panel. And in tax records, this is something that is much more recent, right? So for instance, in Austria, the data is from 2011 onwards. In Belgium, they have started producing it in 2016. In Iceland, they have it for longer. In Estonia, we were among the first ones in accessing it. Started in 2017. In Spain, in 2016. So I think we are quite far in many countries in being able to do a paper that I would particularly love, which is to see, okay, how intergenerational, intragenerational, for instance, mobility compares, and are people that experience more intergenerational mobility also later in life experience also more intergenerational mobility, and so on and so on. I think that for that, we are still missing a lot. In the Nordic countries, I think this is already possible in many places because we have records from the 1990s, so we are able to do that. Or we would be able to do that.
We just have a question online from Jonathan Byers, who asks, is it possible that poor people's income grows 100% and rich people's income grows 1% if the gap still increases? And if so, does that mean there's no mobility in two senses? The rich stay rich but get richer, and the poor stay poor but become poorer.
Okay. Let me see if I understood all these questions. I think it relates more to this context on here. So yeah, it is possible that we see very high income growth rates at the bottom of the distribution and even income decline at the bottom of the distribution. In general, in other countries, what we're seeing is that even in Estonia, which is the country with the flattest in absolute income terms, let's say, distribution of absolute income gains, we see that in reality, mobility tends to narrow the gap between those starting at the bottom and those starting at the top. That doesn't mean, we are not saying that do the incomes at the 1%, at the bottom 1% and at the top 1% have become closer in the two distributions. We're looking at the people that start at the beginning and whether they are narrowing the gap between them. So the pattern that we see in our countries is a general, let's say, process, if you want to call it like this, of convergence. People that start with lower incomes also tend to experience higher absolute gains than people that start with higher incomes. Now, it's true that it is possible to have situations, and this is the case of Estonia, in which despite having very tilted income growth towards the bottom of the distribution, you end up with a redistribution, if you want to call it like this, in absolute terms, that is much more limited, right? And I mean, I think this is not new. There has been a lot of papers in the 2000s on relative and absolute inequality, understand to which income growth can alter both, can reduce maybe relative inequalities, but increase absolute inequalities in advanced economies. I think the only thing that we're doing here is replicating that framework in a mobility context rather than in a static context. I don't know if that answers very well the question. Give a second.
So I do have possibly a final question which concerns the motivation, because I do understand the point when you refer to absolute gain.
Yeah.
Sorry. I mean, to me, it does make quite a bit of sense. I don't understand really the motivation when looking at ranks, because first of all, I mean, you observe individuals at a certain point and you don't know where they were before. So, I mean, the starting point in which you start, so the fact that I'm in this rank today does not imply that I was there 2 years ago, 5 years ago. I mean, if there is a lot of movement, that's in fact, you quite show that people move. But also, I mean, in a general equilibrium situation in which there are no, in which individuals get their marginal productivity, let's say, I mean, no mobility is what we should get. Why do we want mobility? Intragenerational mobility, people are paid their productivity, there is no problem. I mean, in the intergenerational mobility, there is an implicit assumption that what ranks me in the horizontal axis, let's say, is a non-legitimate source of ranking. Yeah. So the fact that my parents were rich or poor should not affect my position in the final distribution. But in the general equilibrium, where all individuals are paid their own marginal productivity, the rank should be 100%, correspond 100% before and after 5 years. So to me, it's not really clear to understand why we should favor intragenerational mobility. I mean, I do understand it in rank, because in absolute terms, because in a way, it concerns a sort of a productivity, progressivity of the non-anonymous growth incidence curve. So I understand it as this, basically. So you are plotting a non-anonymous growth incidence curve and showing me that there is a progressive redistribution. Okay. Then I don't know what happens in the non-anonymous, but that's a different point. But in rank, I don't understand it.
So, a few thoughts on that. First, I think that the idea that the rank that we occupy today is purely based, let's say there's no unfairness in the rank that I occupy today, beyond, let's say, the heritage of my parents is a little bit restrictive. Like, I don't think that in the intergenerational mobility, the assumption is you come from an income of your parent. When you're 30, you reach a given income, and that rank shouldn't correlate necessarily with one of your parents. I think that assuming that from that moment in which you are 30, there are no other structural disadvantages that might make a specific group or a specific population group to move up the income ladder, to move down the income ladder, I think is a little bit restrictive. I mean, for instance, you can have the case of gender. Gender is something that accompanies you throughout your whole life, irrespective of your income, and that might pose a challenge in moving up the income ladder. Right? So that is one reason why looking at relative mobility might make sense, even when we look throughout life, particularly when we look at longer time spans than the ones that probably we're looking here, that at the end are just like 6 years of data, 5 years, right? Now, I agree with you on something, which is that in the intergenerational mobility literature, there's an implicit assumption that the more mobility, the better. Because the less your position correlates with one of your parents, this is treated with a more fair system and so on. I agree with you that in the case of intergenerational mobility, mobility is not necessarily something good. A lot of mobility over your life course in incomes can be instability and can also lead to all sorts of problems, right? And I think that is also why comparing these type of absolute and relative mobility metrics together can provide some value, because if what we were observing was, that there's a lot of mobility, it's not the same that we observe a lot of mobility because people at the bottom can move up the distribution, that if there was a lot of mobility because we have massive shocks, but nobody was experiencing any sort of absolute improvement in living standards, right? So I think that both can have, let's say, a space also in the intergenerational mobility. Yeah, that would be my answer.
Thanks. So it has been a pleasure. Great pleasure to host you today's event at the IAI. Thank you very much, Javier, for presenting this seminar. And thank you to everyone who attended in person and online. And until next time, goodbye.